Welcome to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is an investigation of everything from a British perspective by two brothers who consider themselves to be relatively sane and normal chaps, and we do it one topic at a time. We are Benjamin de Campos, a designer and believer, Jeffrey Campos, a railroad engineer and a devil's advocate. We choose a topic of interest, something that interests us or is suggested to us and we cultivate an interest for, spend a little bit of time researching it, we have a discussion, and then we publish the notes. We do this because we believe that it will foster a greater understanding of the world before we die, and hopefully will prompt further discussion and thought from our listeners. The topic that we'll be discussing this show is going to be the BBC, aka the Beeb. The British Broadcasting Corporation is the largest, oldest, and perhaps most innovative and most revered media broadcasting organization in the world. From its royal charter, inception, in the early 1920s, the BBC has steadfastly remained a publicly owned and financed service with national and international commercial reach. How will modern-day attitudes change regarding its unique funding, allegations of bias, and increasing competition from a disruptive and distributed internet? Do we love Auntie enough to continue funding her unfair advantage over the best of the rest? I'd like to say that we will not be discussing tattoo removal at the Vatican during this show. So what is the BBC? The BBC, in their own words, is the world's leading public service broadcaster. Its mission is to enrich people's lives with programs that inform, educate, and entertain. I mean, they've distilled everything that all of their purposes, everything they believe in, all of their mandates into one sentence. They want to enrich people's lives with information, education, and entertainment. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. While you were speaking there, I was trying to figure out just what I think about the BBC. I guess I'm not really sure what I think about the BBC. And in many ways, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. I'm not sure how much detail we want to go into what the BBC is and what it does.
I think it's important to outline what it actually produces.
Right.
For our international listeners, and we take it for granted being British, but in fact, I mean, it's a media organization. And again, from their the information on their website, they have 10 national television channels. They have interactive TV still. They have 10 national radio stations. They have national TV and radio for the other countries that make up the United Kingdom. Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And also they have a very large and sprawling and mature, that is to say it's been around for a long time, not because of its content, online set of resources. And the BBC World Service, which is directed at the rest of the world and not the UK. And then it has a commercial arm, which is basically all the same shows and some localized shows which are sold as a commercial venture for the BBC. So that's what it actually is.
Okay, well, if it does what it is, then I guess it does. I have been a fan of the BBC. I've certainly enjoyed their radio output. The television output, less of a fan. Might be to do with just getting old and not getting TV anymore. This kind of culminated in me actually getting rid of my TV and telling the BBC that I'm not paying the license fee anymore. Came to a head with broadcasters I just couldn't stand constantly being in my face. Around the time of the Saxgate, Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other broadcasters who I equally can't stand. I didn't want to pay their salaries anymore, and that was now many years ago.
Yeah, you saved yourself £49 a year getting rid of that black and white telly.
Yeah, like black and white TV. But it's not just Jonathan Ross. I mean, I can't stand a lot of the broadcasters that seem to have a permanent career with the BBC. Chris Evans being another one. At the time, Chris Moyles, and just tons of other people that I just scream at the TV. Maybe it's a problem on my end.
Do you like broadcasters on other networks, or is it just the fact that you have to pay for the broadcasters on the BBC?
It might be something to do with that, and I think also I just disliked the fact that these people just didn't go away, like Jonathan Ross, and I was going to say Jeremy Clarkson, but we know there's been a bit of an update to that. These people just were forever on our screens, and I just had enough. It was like, I don't want to see you anymore, Jonathan Ross. I can't stand you. I don't think you're good at your job. And just knowing a little bit about how the BBC works as well, being such a haven for talentless people, but also paradoxically, so what I mean by that is the people there who don't seem to be particularly good. I mean, people who in the background, I've known a few of, who for some reason are able to stay at the BBC doing what they do. But yet, at the same time, a lot of the on-screen talent speak of having this constant fear that they're going to be fired. I'm not sure how true that is.
It sounds like you're hinting at an old boys network.
I think it's definitely very well known that there is something like that. And I think Armando Iannucci, who I do think is a very talented man, he was talking about how there is that kind of culture there, how it is kind of sleazy, or it can be sleazy, and all this kind of thing. I think I just had enough of the BBC, and I just wanted to check out of it. Actually, while we're on that subject, I got a lot of threatening letters from the TV licensing people, even though I legally decided not to pay TV license. I didn't have a TV anymore, and they knew all about it, and they sent me a letter saying, "Okay, fine, we're not going to be, hassling you." They then promptly hassled me. I kept getting letters more and more threatening about how I'm going to go to prison for not having a TV license. And it's like the part of their organization that sends out the letters wasn't speaking to the part of the organization that has the actual database of who has a TV license. It
sounds like Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs all over again.
Yeah.
Just to explain to anyone who doesn't know, the BBC is unique in its funding in that it gathers the vast majority of its revenue through a system of taxation called the license fee. In their own words, everyone in the UK who watches or records TV programs at the same as they are shown on TV, strange phrasing there, but live TV, needs to be covered by a TV license. This includes TVs, computers, mobile phones, games consoles, digital boxes, and DVD/VHS recorders. It's £150-ish a year, or £49 a year if you can prove you only have a black and white television. And apparently there are less than 12,000 black and white televisions left in the UK that are receiving live broadcasts. So, a vanishingly small number of black and white. So it's mostly £150, £149.50 a year for every license payer. So the assumption is that everybody who is above the age of 18 should be paying this license fee, because no doubt they'll have something capable of receiving live broadcasts.
Well, there's a real grey area there, because during my time of living in England without a TV license, I could legally go on the BBC iPlayer and watch BBC TV, just as long as I wasn't doing it as it was being broadcast. And were I to accidentally click on something that was currently being broadcast, a little warning would pop up saying, "Hey, you need to have a TV license to watch this. Do you want to continue?" No. And so I'd say no. So it is a really weird situation that I think they're going to need to review quite heavily. Particularly the whole black and white TV thing. I mean, Christ, how antiquated are they?
Well, there are evidently almost 12,000 black and white televisions actively being watched in the country.
Well, I think that's what people are saying in order to pay less of a license fee, but...
Yeah, I don't think it's TV detector vans driving around the area and somehow through magic able to work out exactly what is passively receiving the television signals. But
Actually, I should also say, just while we're on this subject, another thing that annoyed me was the tone of the BBC when talking about how they're going to be clamping down on people who don't pay their television license. It was like really strict and nasty. Like, you are a serious criminal and we're going to hurt you if we find out that you're not paying your TV license. Do you remember the ads?
yes,
Remember how kind of dark and I don't know.
indeed.
I'm not sure how to describe them, but it seems like they should be more apologetic. I'm sorry you have to pay this TV license. We know our shows are garbage, but if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's the tone they should take. And I think one reason why I think they don't really have, or at least they shouldn't project the authority of a bureau that is capable of causing you pain if you're caught consuming their product, is the ease with which one can receive their signal. I mean, they're spraying the entire country with their product, and in an unencrypted fashion, and anybody can pick up the signal and watch it. And it's, it's like putting a pile of gold coins on a chair in the middle of a public park, and then going absolutely berserk if anybody touches it.
It's exactly like the Nazis who would threaten you with death by picking up British radio signals.
I can see the similarity there. So there's the unique funding, and it's a lot of funding. No other organization in this country is funded in the same way. They're all commercial enterprises, or I suppose there's a certain amount of charitable work that they do, and I'm sure they can accrue some funding through charitable work in some dodgy way. The BBC is unique, and one of the reasons why the BBC is unique is because it was initially set up with a royal charter. And a royal charter is a set of mandates, and it stipulated certain purposes for the corporation, and they are these: sustaining citizenship and civil society, promoting education and learning, stimulating creativity and cultural excellence, representing the UK, its nations, regions, and communities, bringing the UK to the world and the world to the UK, and in promoting its other purposes, helping to deliver to the public the benefit of emerging communications technologies and services, and in addition, taking a leading role in the switch over to digital television. That obviously wasn't part of the original Royal Charter, but that certainly has been delivered, and I think everybody is enjoying digital television these days, except for those 12,000 people who have analog black and white televisions.
No, I didn't even know they were still broadcasting in analog. I thought it's all digital. Surely you needed like a set-top box to be able to watch
I think
BBC
now
TV.
that is true. You can plug a digital set-top box into a black and white television. They do certainly when they first brought out those boxes, it did say they support black and white televisions. So that is the way they must be doing it, because yes, indeed, they do not broadcast an analog signal any longer. And I do believe that once that switchover happened, the government immediately sold off a vast swath of spectrum to the telecommunications operators and the wireless data operators for insane amounts of money, billions and billions of pounds. It's incredible. I'll find that out and I'll put that in the show notes. Actually, it's quite interesting. But so they have a mandate. They're set up with a charter. They have a purpose. Whether or not they achieve what they set out to achieve could be an aspect of the BBC that doesn't necessarily chime with its value as perceived by the taxpayers. So they could very well produce lots of interesting documentaries in a bid to educate the citizenship. But so do a lot of commercial operators. Why should the BBC have such an advantage over everyone else? Is it because they attract talent for cultural reasons, or I mean, really, is it just no longer viable that they get this funding and they just and even as they do, they're still unable to compete in terms of quality with other operators? I mean, I think they do produce excellent product, and they do a lot of they produce a lot of output that I don't have coming, or at least I haven't experienced coming from anyone else. I mean, and I think particularly of their radio output. I'm a real Radio 4 listener, and Radio 4 is I suppose it's a reasonably eclectic, non-musical, non-curated, and certainly not commercial station with news programs, current affairs programs, cultural programs, farming programs, and drama and comedy serials. And most of my attitudes towards the BBC center around Radio 4, I think. And I believe Radio 4 gives me probably 25% of its content, which I find interesting enough to continue to listen to. But I have issues with Radio 4 because the 75% of its content I think is fairly awful. And I'd really rather not even know it's actually around. And I'd rather just have that 25% that I like. And through the many innovations of the internet, I can get what I want in the form of podcasts. So all of the programs that I like to listen to on Radio 4, I actually consume as podcasts and rarely listen to the station live. And the same goes for television. Television, I never ever watch live. And if I ever do watch any of it, it'll be in the form of the BBC iPlayer, which is their watch later archive of programming available on the internet. Do you watch anything live or listen to anything live anymore on the BBC?
Well, I mean, I don't listen to BBC really, not since I moved to the United States.
Bearing in mind, Wimbledon is just around the corner.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, I've never watched that anyway. But I, like you, used to listen to Radio 4. I actually prefer live radio to podcasts because I like the immediacy of it. I like it when they talk about stuff that's happening right now. Not just breaking news, but just generally, podcasts by the very nature are yesterday's newspapers. But I used to listen to Radio 4 and I used to listen to 5 Live, and I used to find myself just getting annoyed by more than 50% of the programming. BBC Radio 5 Live, more than half of it is sport, which doesn't interest me at all, so that's gone. Radio 4, too much drama, which I can't stand, particularly Radio 4 drama, and comedy that isn't funny, and a particular tone of comedy that isn't
Left
funny.
wing.
We can talk about this. Well, yeah, we can talk about the political stance that the BBC takes right across the board, and I think a lot of programming on Radio 4 is no exception to that. There's nothing wrong with being left-wing. I'm quite left-leaning, but there is a certain tone which is very noticeable, despite the BBC claiming that they're impartial, which I really don't think they are.
Well, they claim that in words, according to their editorial guidelines, and I quote: "The BBC strives to be fair to all, fair to those our output is about, fair to contributors, and fair to our audiences. BBC content should be based on respect, openness, and straight dealing. We also have an obligation under the Ofcom Broadcasting Code to avoid unjust or unfair treatment of individuals or organizations in programs." That's Rule 7.1 from the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, according to the BBC editorial guidelines. And the Ofcom is a regulatory body grounded by the government. It's a watchdog for all broadcasters.
Okay, well, before we talk about their overt political
Fair
stance,
and balanced.
fair and balanced, I think we should talk about a big problem with the BBC. And I'm not the first person to notice this, and that's their fake fairness. always having an opposing view, even when there is a very weak opposing view, or maybe there isn't an opposing view, so they make one up. So it's 50-50, which I think is dishonest.
But is that implied, or is that your takeaway?
No, that's definitely. This is a fact.
No, I know that's what they do, but you added the 50% equal weighting. Just because they're showing you two sides of a coin, it doesn't mean that those are two equal sides or have equal value. They give an opposing view.
Well, I mean, they devote equal time to each view. So, I mean, it is 50-50. And I'll give you an example of this. Victoria Derbyshire, who has a show on 5 Live, who I quite like. She's quite a serious, formidable.
She's moved to television now, I think.
Oh, has she? Yeah, but she's quite redoubtable. And she had someone on, and there was like a shower of praise for this person that she had on. Like 100 emails. But then she said, "Oh, but there's been 1 or 2 emails where people have been quite critical." And she read the 2 emails, giving that just the same amount of time as reporting about how much praise there's been. And, that she made it 50-50. And it wasn't a 50-50.
Yeah, but I can see a benefit in that. If there are 100 emails for something and 2 emails against, I would personally be more interested in why, what motivated the dissenters. Why are they not, along with not thinking along the same lines as the majority? I want to know why. Are they just lunatics, or actually, hang on a minute, their point about the Earth actually not being flat might be a good point? That is all. There's value in reading the dissent. It's a mistake just to discount entirely and just go along with the crowd. You never know. You could be completely badly, deadly wrong. Also, people can get fired up about a particular viewpoint, and maybe one person who isn't particularly fired up but actually could be bothered to get out of his chair and write a response is the guy who has the more salient point to make. So, there are always hotheads who might form the majority, when in fact the fair and balanced and reasonable view are the people who are less likely to get involved. But when they do, they're worth listening to.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it happens so often on the BBC. I think it's really, really bad.
Well, I think they certainly feel compelled to give more than one view on any particular topic. And sometimes it is ludicrous because there's no controversy, and they'll try
exactly, but it
generate some.
No, it becomes so detached from the world. Like, for example, every time if they mention a brand name, they then have to either mention a few more brand names to balance it out, or then say all other such and suches are also available. Like, if they talk about McDonald's, they say, "Oh, well, other fast food restaurants are also available," or whatever. And it's just like, well, why do that? All that does is just make me notice that that's not how anyone speaks.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I've heard exactly that as well. And
exactly what?
That they will feel the need to inform you that they are speaking about one of many. Or, yes. Or give you opposing views on most topics. It doesn't bother me particularly. I mean, I know what they're doing, and I know why they're doing it. Right. But the most important thing is just give me the facts. Give me the facts. Don't spin anything. But
which they do.
Which I guess everybody does to a certain extent. But the most important thing is as long as they're not distorting facts, that's the most important thing. And I don't think they do. I think they seem to be reasonably straightforward when it comes to the facts that they have through their investigative journalism, which they do. But I suppose they can choose what to broadcast and what not to broadcast, and therefore there's the bias. But
yes,
I was reading about their lost 9/11 footage. It didn't seem to be too clear or straightforward on why they lost that footage. How could they have possibly lost that
Mhm.
footage? Why did that woman tell us that a building had fallen down before it had actually fallen down? These are all strange occurrences, and the
What are you
reasons
suggesting?
that they gave, I don't think were as clear as they could be. The reason why I mentioned all of that is that it's not just a case of presenting a particular topic or observation in a fair and balanced way. It's also presenting a fair and balanced amount of information by completely remaining silent on a particular topic speaks volumes of their perceived fairness. So they really do have to give equal time to all the major topics. And they certainly say they strive to, and I believe they do. I mean, they do cover a lot of topics throughout all their different media outlets, of which they have many.
So where were you going? Where were you going with that 9/11 footage? What do you mean?
I was mentioning that because they can choose to broadcast or not broadcast information. So if they have information that they have accumulated through their investigative journalism and choose not to broadcast it or cover it in any way, then that's their bias in action. That's swaying their fair and balanced mandate.
Were you suggesting that they didn't really lose the footage and they just pretended to in order to not cover it?
No, I think they didn't give us a straight answer. When I say us, they didn't give the license fee payer a straight answer when they were asked how they could have lost that footage and in what circumstances. They were very, very vague on that. And it was really important at the time. This is incredibly important information that they had, and they said, "Oh, we don't have it any longer." And the reasons for this were unsatisfactory. And I think that this has happened a lot in the BBC's history, where they have sort of omitted to mention certain events along a story and have mentioned others, thus giving the impression of a culpability on the part of a wrongdoer, for instance, purely by the amount of coverage they're getting or not getting.
Right. Okay.
But are they outdated? Are they getting just past their prime? Do we have a need for the BBC any longer? I certainly enjoy not watching advertisements and not listening to advertisements, but I can imagine I could perhaps spend that £150 a year on other services. For instance, I could spend that on Now TV, Netflix, Amazon Prime Videos, a CNN subscription, and a Fox News subscription, all together with that amount of money.
What I will say about this kind of thing is I used to be quite blinkered and a little bit sort of sheltered and parochial in my thinking when it comes to the quality of the BBC, particularly documentaries. I always believed that BBC make the best documentaries. I mean, they are the BBC. Everyone wants to be involved with a documentary if it's being made with the BBC. And relatively recently, with the help of YouTube and maybe Netflix and maybe a few other outlets, I've discovered that that's not actually the case. And other documentary makers can be just as good, if not better, than the BBC. Better because maybe they don't have this BBC agenda that they need to stick to, and they can, really push the boundaries and go places where the BBC wouldn't for various political correct reasons, possibly. So, in that regard, then maybe yes, the BBC might be outdated.
I think there's still a gap, and the BBC are leading, generally speaking, but that gap is narrowing quite significantly and very quickly indeed. And and other operators are catching up. I mean, Netflix have hired or bought the production team behind most of the internationally best-selling documentaries in the BBC to produce their own nature series. But I think the BBC are still very innovative. They're leading the way as far as 4K broadcasting is concerned. Their 4K cameras and the way in which they edit live events are leading the world. And their BBC, their sports coverage is incredible. I have no interest in sport at all.
Me either.
So most of that's lost on me, unfortunately. But a huge percentage of the overall budget for programming at the BBC is spent on sport, and they invest a lot of money in the actual sports themselves. So, that's of great value to many,
but not us, but not you and I. That's a waste of our taxpayer.
It is. I mean, absolutely. If I could have a little list of tick boxes of the things that I'm going to watch and things that I'm not going to watch, I would untick sport. I'll give the Football World Cup and Wimbledon a look in. For a few seconds, but that's about it, and I can certainly live without it. And it is a huge part of the budget, so, if I could have my bill reduced commensurately, that would be great. But it's the international revenue as well, of course. The BBC is internationally renowned as a local media producer in most countries. A quarter of the revenue for the BBC quarter of the revenue is from BBC World sales, their commercial arm.
But don't you think there's something a bit crappy there? How you, with your paying your TV license, pays for their salaries and programming, and then they go sell the stuff that you've bought for them to other countries, and then they just pocket all that money.
Well, no, they do drive that money back into investment, into programming. But no, I know what you mean. It's sort of like scientific papers. If you want to get a hold of a scientific paper from a university in this country, you need to buy it. And you think about, hang on a minute, the research and development is funded by the taxpayer in this country. And the results of the science we have to pay for, and you think we should be sent it.
Yeah.
we paid for it. So it's one of those sort of double-pronged absurdities, which is peculiar, and perhaps it'll be one of the many nails in the coffin of the license fee when it comes. And I think it will come. I think the license fee does its days are numbered. I think it is not popular, and I think it's less and less warranted, given the prevalence of alternative media. I mean, the internet alone is an absolute garden of news streams coming from every direction, and there's some really good news out there. I mean, you could probably satisfy your desire to keep up with the comings and goings of the planet through the Google News algorithm alone. And that's just a mindless algorithm that produces content. And it's pretty compelling. It's pretty good. It's extremely up to date. Nothing beats it as far as when events come to fruition through journalism. Google seems to get it before everybody else, which is peculiar. And of course, there are the independent network operating news organizations like CNN and Fox that have been around for ages, who are seen as bona fide competitors to the news. The BBC news offerings. So there are always alternatives to the BBC. But then we think of drama. What are the alternatives insofar as televised drama, for instance? The competition to the BBC is absolutely massive.
Yes.
The American networks seem to be enjoying a golden era for television programs at the moment, and there's 1,000 million of them. And a very large proportion of them are very good indeed, extremely high standards. And then you have EastEnders on the BBC.
What I will say about this is another thing that I used to be quite snobby about BBC and comedy. I thought, well, it's the best. It's just like, it just doesn't compare. The Office, Faulty Towers, and then Faulty Towers is like 40 years old, and there's only like 3 hours of show, both of them. And so, all in the more recent era, I've been watching American programs where there's just like so many episodes. And I know they have teams of writers and all that, but hey, it works. It's good value. There's a lot of entertainment there, and I just don't think the BBC even remotely compares to what a lot of the American program makers are doing.
Yeah. So to counter the funding through taxation advantage that the BBC enjoys, we have American producers who simply have an economy of scale working in their favor. Given the size of the market, they are able to feed 50 writers and they're able to feed a really high production value and all the technology and distribution that goes along with it. So perhaps the perfect competitor to the BBC is simply a market-rich commercial competitor, because the goals I think are reasonably similar. You think the BBC has a mandate; it wants to entertain, educate, and inform. But those are desires that people generally have. That's why the mandates are there, and therefore, if there is a market, there will be a supplier, and that supplier is a commercial supplier. After profits, in order to deliver the same service. I think the greatest distinction is the advertising, the direct advertising. The BBC and all of their content that is directed at the UK is advertisement free for the most part. I mean, occasionally you'll see logos or names of organizations, but there are no set advertising periods during television or radio programming, and there certainly isn't any in-show product placement style advertising in the BBC, which I certainly see in other commercial productions. And
I wouldn't be so sure about that.
That's definitely a good thing in my book. I don't want to be advertised at, unless it's a really spectacularly good television program, in which case I will actively buy all the products that are advertised in the breaks.
Yeah, that's not really been a problem with, Netflix doesn't show any advertisements, for example.
It's because of its unique funding.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not really something... I don't see that as being quite the edge it used to be, now that I don't watch TV in the traditional sense. I watch Netflix, for example. And so, it's not a big deal. It's not a deal breaker anymore.
No, and indeed, Netflix seems to be the sort of service that offers you a few checkboxes and you pay for what you like.
Yes.
What I mean by that is that, for me personally, there's no sport on Netflix.
Yes.
There are a couple of sports documentaries, but there's no massive amounts of live sports events, or you can watch pre-recorded events at all, which is great because I don't watch them anyway. Instead, I have, with Netflix, a lot of really, really good television series programming that I can binge watch if I wanted to, with no advertising, and it's really high quality. I was watching a program called Sense8, which is a Netflix-produced, Netflix-only television series, produced and directed, I believe, by the Wachowski siblings, and it was very high-quality program. I mean, I can't remember the last television program I watched with such a high quality from the BBC. It must have been a period drama, I think, which is something they used to excel at, but I think even there their crown has slipped somewhat. But really, I don't watch television on the BBC at all, really, unless there's something, a really big world event or a really outstanding television show that's been highly rated to the point where I'm motivated to switch it on. But I think the picture changes radically with their other types of media platforms like their online content. Now, the BBC News page is my first port of call every day on the internet, and that has been the case for as long as I can remember. I always went to the BBC website for news. First thing
As
I
long
do.
as you can remember. What about
As
before?
long as I can remember.
Before the internet.
No, I can't remember before. Was there a before the internet? No, as long as for as long as I can remember using computers on the internet, the BBC News page was the first page I went to.
Right.
To get the news, to be updated, to be informed of the state of the planet. And I think it's great. I think it's short pieces, easy to read, well produced, absolute state of the art websites. Their online presence is fabulous. Obviously, massive amounts of money have been spent on it. A lot of thought have gone into it. They've been around for a very long time. To say they're outdated and look at their online content and facilities, I think you're just flat out wrong. They are bleeding edge when it comes to online. You, as in if anybody were to say that.
Right.
I think they're bleeding edge online, and they continue to innovate. Their 4K content is coming along nicely, and that's for live 4K streams. And I don't think YouTube does that. I think YouTube, you can upload 4K. You can even upload 4K at 60 frames per second, but they don't do any sort of 4K broadcasting. So online, they've adapted to very well, and it's not like they're new to the internet. They've been there since day one. Their bbc.co.uk website went live in the 90s. So they've been around a very, very long time, and they know what they're doing on the internet, and perhaps that's where they're going. Perhaps all so-called terrestrial broadcasting will just disappear into the information superhighway, and they will exist as a Netflix-like operator.
I think that's just what's happening. I think now, program makers, they have a product, and you could choose to watch that whenever you want. I mean, it's just on demand. It just seems like such a old-fashioned idea of, such and such is on at 7:00. Hang on, and my favorite show's on, that kind of thing.
Yes, set the DVR.
Yeah.
And I think the BBC iPlayer is outstanding for exactly that. There's a few limitations to it. I think that's because of the international nature of the internet. But generally speaking, it works extremely well. But again, you can only access that content if you're also paying a internet service provider money. So, the amounts of money mount up. Before you would have to pay your capex on a television set, and then you would receive the signals from the BBC, which you would need to pay £100 or so for yearly. But now you can watch the very same BBC content online, also still paying the license fee, and additionally paying your internet service provider access to the internet. You'd think the BBC would give you that for free, but I think the technology was just not flexible enough to offer that sort of access. So there are programming highlights. I mean, there are reasons why we watch the BBC every now and again. The Queen's speech, I don't know if that's solely on BBC One, but I think I watched it last year on BBC One. You have a really outstanding documentary series, and they certainly have made a lot of those, or at least Mr. Attenborough has made a lot of those. The BBC excels at panel programs. They have the highest scoring and most popular panel programs in the UK, although when it comes to scoring, they sort of make it up. And films, they premiere a lot of films on the BBC. BBC Films funds a lot of films, produces a lot for television, and they broadcast a lot. So it's definitely in the film space as well. But they have a lot to feed with content. I mean, they have, as I mentioned at the beginning, they have 10 national television channels and 10 national radio channels, all of which are virtually 24/7 and need constant content to feed them. So they buy an awful lot of foreign programming, mostly American. They feed hundreds of independent television production companies in this country. Like the NHS, they feed a lot of commercial companies in order to fill all of these channels, and they haven't been able to fully, and they have axed a few channels here and there, and they've slimmed themselves down a little bit, and they're constantly looking for areas where they can make cuts in order to save money, because I think they know that it cannot continue the way it is. Not even the mighty EastEnders can keep them afloat indefinitely. But perhaps Top Gear can. Moving swiftly onto our scandals section, there have been a lot of scandals and a lot of not so real scandals, but quite perceived scandals throughout the entire nearly 100-year run of the BBC, including political scandals where they have slandered politicians and military leaders, to where they have misrepresented the aims and goals of countries in times of war, all the way up to the most recent, I suppose you could say, scandals. And the one that really springs to mind is Top Gear, which is a television program ostensibly about cars and car technology, but really about three guys who are mates, and they do matey things. Very long-running show. The principal presenter, Jeremy Clarkson, is a very outgoing, gregarious sort of presenter and media broadcaster of long standing, who was fired effectively from the BBC, and the program came to a screeching halt. And now there's a big question mark over exactly how it's going to continue, although I think it's been filled in a little bit by the BBC by their reappointment of Chris Evans, another quasi-controversial, a little bit unpredictable and gregarious media presenter, just like Jeremy Clarkson, who will be taking over the program. But this was it was a big case and a bit of a scandal for the BBC, because it showed you as the BBC as an institution whereby it's not necessarily the public choice or any kind of democracy that enters into long-ranging decisions. It's a small cabal of leaders inside the institution who call the shots, and they can effectively do whatever they want, and they can make an example of somebody, or they can be very lenient. It's quite odd, the inner workings. As transparent as they try to be, I think the inner workings of the BBC is still quite communist feeling. What do you think?
Well, the Clarkson thing is interesting. I'm not a fan of Clarkson, but to me, he was very kind of non-BBC, because he was quite conservative, you could say. I think he was definitely right of centre, which, in my view, is very un-BBC. So I don't know if his sacking might have been sort of, or the actual act of sacking him might have been a little bit too much. But because of Clarkson's worldview, he simply had to go. I couldn't help but think that there might be something like that. I also think there's a little bit of the BBC cutting off its nose to spite its face, because it's well known just how much revenue Top Gear brings in for the BBC. It's a very, very super popular program all around the world. And I loathe Chris Evans even more than I loathe Jeremy Clarkson. And I don't know. I mean, I can fully imagine that the program will die with Chris Evans at the helm. But having said that, I think the BBC is a powerful enough organization to make the Chris Evans hosted show work somehow. Stifling criticism and somehow getting the right people to talk about it. I think they're usually quite good at that. So who knows?
I think it'll be a roaring success. I think it'll do phenomenally well, just because of the format of the program. I certainly don't think it was Jeremy Clarkson and his mates that were the principal pull of that program internationally.
Oh, I do.
I don't.
Absolutely.
I think I think the BBC think that as well. That's why they've hired Evans, a virtual clone of Jeremy Clarkson.
He's not a virtual clone of Jeremy Clarkson. I think big time that it was Clarkson and his larger than life un-PC personality talking unironic blokey crap with his mates. I love cars, but I hate Top Gear. I think Chris Evans has less resonance with blokey blokes and is much more hateable than Clarkson. But I think the BBC will work their magic and, as I say, get the right people talking about it, silence the dissenters, and make it a success. Even though I think Evans will be a failure, he's no Clarkson when it comes to being outrageous and saying what only small-minded people will think.
I don't know too much about Chris Evans, but I think on the face of it, it sounds like a good decision. I mean, he's very qualified for the role. He has an awful lot of matey, jokey, youth-oriented media skill and experience, and I just can't see it being anything other than a total success. I think there was talk that there would be a female presenter. Perhaps Susie Perry, which would be great. But I doubt it. I think it is a matey sort of program, and it really does need 2 or 3 chaps to make it happen in the vein and that it has been cultivated to flow along. But who knows? It could be a total change. But I feel very strongly that it will be extremely successful, if not more successful than it has ever been in its sort of Phoenix-like rebirth. Which will happen soon, I'm betting. Because
Time will
indeed,
tell.
The franchise definitely made an insane amount of money. They were just
Okay. Well,
I'll probably have to
speaking
try
of
and
betting,
find some figures on this, but
yeah.
definitely
Speaking
is
of betting, okay. Well, you think it's going to be a success. I think it's going to be a failure. Time will tell.
I'll write that down in the book. Time will tell. But as you say, if it isn't successful, the BBC will make it successful. But I think it just will. By the very format of the program, as I've said.
Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see. We've stated our cases. I think it won't be. I just think I'd like to think that we've had enough of Chris Evans. I had enough of him 20 years ago. I just think Yankee Doodles will just loathe the man. He's very loathable. Definitely more so than
he's
Clarkson.
been working hard all that time, ever since the early days. He hasn't stopped. He's been a radio presenter for God knows how long. He's lots of...
Have you ever listened to his radio show?
They've even brought back his original program, TFI Friday.
No, they have not.
Yes, they have
not brought that back.
Recommissioned with him at the helm. I'm afraid
You're kidding me.
I kid
Where did
you
you
not.
hear that? Stop talking the
It's in
same
the
time I
news.
talk. This must be a lag thing. Every time I speak, you speak at the exact same time. Let me just look this up. So you think TFI Friday is back?
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
Man. Well, I'm glad I'm not living in the UK anymore.
I'm sure it'll have an international airing. Well, I think that's all I have on the BBC. I fully mean to go and enjoy a little bit more of it now. I think they should go on. What I do enjoy of the BBC, I do enjoy of the BBC, and I would hate to see it completely disappear. And I would also hate to see it become super commercial. I would like them to break up their programming into at least categories that I could pay for. And I can, like Sky TV subscription, I can opt out of the sport and I can opt out of here. Mm-hmm. And if I ever wanted to dip my toes into those categories, I can pay and play. That would be great.
Yes.
Or if they went for a more Netflixy type slimmed down version of the BBC where you get far fewer categories and less content, I could go for that as well. And everything moving to the internet, I could probably do that as well. But hey, the internet dies sometimes, and if you really need to learn about that news story, it's nice to be able to turn something on that isn't actually connected to the internet. So, as far as television is concerned, maybe it'll last for another 20 years or so.
We could talk a little bit about diversity, how the BBC has changed in one area that they've changed, whereas BBC English used to be a thing, but now you're far more likely to be on the BBC if you sport a regional accent. That's definitely a new thing.
Yeah, representation. They want to be more representative, so they try and fill as many slots as possible with all the diversity the country has to offer. It's in the mandate to try and be representative, so you can't blame them for trying to do that. But Radio 4, for instance, the accent is still very similar. But then the argument for the radio broadcasters is that people need to be able to understand you. Accents and regionalization are a muddying of the waters. And really, there is a center point in the English language that is the clearest and the most accurately communicated. And the BBC believe they have arrived at that many years ago, and they persist in hiring people or training people to sound quite similar. But I think it's a good thing because it's about clarity and it's about the content. I don't care where somebody is from when I'm listening to BBC Radio 4. I'm much more interested in what they're saying and that they're communicating the information correctly and accurately. Television perhaps is a little bit different. There's the added dimension of vision, which adds quite literally a little bit of color to the mix. Anyway, you've been listening to eclecticist.co.uk. This is a show where we talk about any topic. If you have any ideas or any criticism or feedback, please pop along to our website and fill in the contact form at the bottom. There's also information on all of our past shows and links to the audio and links to our show notes. For our outro music for this show, we're going to play the BBC Radio theme. This was a medley of classical music that was broadcast before the early morning farming programs between 1978 and 2006. I'm referring to the years there, not the times. It comprises a medley of quite popular, certainly at the time, a medley of classical themes, and it haunted me for many, many years. Right up until probably 2011, I could never get it out of my head. It's just the weirdest thing to listen to at 5 o'clock in the morning. But it's still available and hopefully out of copyright, as all the constituent themes are out of copyright. Thank you very much and good evening.